Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Madison, and welcome to everyone for joining us today. Thanks for being here. I first want to start off, I'll introduce myself. My name is Julie McDonald. I work at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, the Minnesota's Lake Superior Coastal Program. We are working here in Minnesota's coastal area on Lake Superior with funding from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Office for Coastal Management. And this climate conversation is a partnership, a collaborative between Minnesota Sea Grant, 1854 Treaty Authority, the DNR, Wisconsin Sea Grant, and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. So thanks to all those partners for helping us put these presentations together every month. And we've been doing this for about 7 years, so it's really a good thing. Our mission is really to aid in improving climate communication skills for everyone. We want to, overall, in the Western Lake Superior region, improve climate change related data collection and sharing, even if that's just inspiring people to do so. We hope to motivate and support community-based climate adaptation and really just increase climate conversation in all the sectors and broaden the impact, because it really will affect all of us. And it's really important that we do include and consider climate justice in all the conversations. So if you could please give that some thought as you're thinking about questions for today as you listen to the speakers. So our first speaker today is Pete Boulay from the Minnesota State Climatology Office. Pete acts as an operational climatologist, and he handles a lot of data requests that come into the state. He'll probably give you an idea of what some of those are. He's the statewide coordinator for various volunteer rain gauge networks throughout Minnesota, which is really important for data collection and our understanding of where we're at in climate change. And Pete has degrees in meteorology and broadcasting from St. Cloud State University. So you'll hear his broadcasting voice in a minute. And then after Pete talks, we're going to hear from Maggie Thelen, and we will hear more about Maggie in a few minutes. But if you have questions, please share them in the chat, and we will get to them after the two presentations. So thank you very much. And Pete, if you want to go ahead and share your screen. And you are muted right now, Pete, as well. There it is. It's working now, Pete. Thanks.
Is it working good?
Yep.
Always, that's the biggest test is it working? So thank you, Julie, for inviting me back. I always love to talk about anything in regards to Lake Superior and in the area surrounding it. You'll see in my slides, there's all kinds of pictures because we just had to go up there. This is a good excuse to go to the North Shore, of course, of any time to take pictures. And when Julie first asked me to do this, I had no idea at this point we'd be in such a huge drought in the state. So a lot of my slides have something to do with that. I'm going to talk about heat waves and other things, maybe a little bit of a peek in the future too. So I'll advance here. Hang on a second. So a little bit about me. I had to pick a summer picture. I guess I'm outstanding in my field, I guess you might say. I've always liked weather ever since I was a kid and wanted to be a meteorologist, a weather forecaster. Long ago, if you're an AM radio listener in Duluth, I was one of the people that was supposed to be the AM 610 KDAL Weather Command. So I said that about 1,000 times, I think. But now I'm in the DNR State Climatology Office, and I get to look at what happened in the weather more than what's going to happen. My accuracy improved greatly when I started looking at what has already happened. Quick trivia question for everybody out there. What do you think the highest temperature that was ever recorded at the Duluth Weather Bureau. This is a picture of the instrument shelter they used to have in the old Weather Bureau when it was not really downtown, it was more halfway up the hill. What do you think the warmest temperature ever was? So I don't know if people are going to try to guess in the chat or not, but people will give a shot at it.
Some answers. Oh, 84, 100. Someone who said, 74. Someone said which station? 100, 106, 95, 102.
Somebody guessed it. I heard it. 106, July 13th, 1936. And actually, Duluth has only seen 100 degrees or more 3 times. That's it. And it was all in July of 1936. Duluth has not seen 100 degrees since then. So that was an extraordinary month across the entire state, not just Duluth, but everywhere. So long history of weather observing in Duluth. So a little bit of today. I'll go over what has happened in Minnesota and Northeast Minnesota, what is currently happening, and maybe what could happen in the future. And one thing to keep in mind with any weather pattern we're in, there will always be variability. And right now, our variability is leaning towards drought. Kind of take you back in time a little bit. Remember these days when it was wet? It used to be really, really wet. And, you know, here's the biggest rain event perhaps in Northeast Minnesota's history. This one always will go stand down as one of our big, huge storms. It's the June 19th and 2012 flood. Two harbors saw over 10 inches of rain in 24 hours. It was a very devastating flood. And this one has always been referred to as one of our biggest floods in Minnesota history. So it was really wet. And in fact, if you looked at 2010 through 2019, over 10 years, the nearshore area had accumulated 20 inches of surplus moisture over the years. And it's even wetter as you go farther south. So we had an incredibly wet decade of the 2010s. And then 2020 came along, things began to change a little bit, and it began to dry out. It was below normal for precipitation for the year across much of Minnesota, including along the North Shore. Departures, 4 to 6 inches in 2020. We didn't notice it very much in 2020 because we had all that surplus moisture from the wet 2010s. So there's a little bit of a delay. So I'm going to reference this Minnesota Climate Trends tool. Anybody at home could make their own graphs anywhere in the state. You could choose the entire state or counties or anything you want. And I'm going to use this tool for the next slide here. So I just picked Northeast Minnesota, and this is January through December, going all the way back to 1895. And basically this ends in 2020. So 2020 ended a big long streak of wet years. Look at all those wet years before 2020. We hadn't had a lot of dry years. If you look farther back in time, you can see it has been really dry. That's 1976, one of the low points. And then 1910 always stands out across the entire state as the driest year on record. So we've had some really dry years in the past. And here we are here in 2020. Now, 2021 so far, we are the driest in Northeast Minnesota, the driest January through July since 1980. It's interesting, you might hear a lot about the drought of 88, but actually in northern Minnesota, 1980 was drier in many respects. 1988, there was some rainfall up in the northern part of the state, but in 1980, much drier up north. You can see that on the graph there. It kind of stands out. So there's many levels of drought. We're in a drought right now, no doubt about it. But when you look backwards in time, here's a graph that shows 1931 through 2012. The 2012 was the last time we had a real drought in the state. And this is the Palmer Drought Index. And it's one of the main indexes used over time to gauge how wet or dry it is. This graph is showing the lowest monthly Palmer Drought Severity Index value in the state at that time. And I threw in the lowest we've seen so far this year. It's in northwest Minnesota at -5. And that's exceptional drought once you get down to -5. And that's what's going on in northwest Minnesota. Now, northeast Minnesota is not too far behind. It's about -4.3. So that's one level up from an exceptional drought, more of an extreme drought, but certainly we're going in the wrong direction this year. And as you look backwards in time, there were some really big droughts. Look back into, this is the whole state, 1988 drought for the statewide numbers, very low. And then you go even farther back in time, the 1930s droughts really stand as the worst drought we've seen in the state since weather records began. So drought comes in many, many flavors. Here's a drought probably nobody remembers at all. This is the drought of 1947. So at the time, though, it was dry for just a couple of weeks, but just having the timing in August 1947, I mean, this made the papers. You know, there's the weather guy, complete with pipe, of course, going out to check how much rain has fallen for the year in Duluth, and it was dry. You know, it was a drought during the summer, and it just shows if, you know, you have a few dry weeks in the summer, people start to notice, you know, that your lawns become brown and things like that. So there's all kinds of levels of drought. This is how we classify drought beginning in about 2000. Beginning about 2000, we have something called the Drought Monitor. You might have seen that on the news at night. That's what we're using to monitor the changes of drought week by week. And there's categories of this drought. It starts out with D0, abnormally dry, which is really not a drought level, but it's going in or coming out of drought. And then D1, moderate drought, as kind of the first stage of drought. D2, severe drought, up another level. And then you get even worse with D3 and D4. Those years on the left show the last time we reached every level in the state through last year. And as you can see, we hadn't seen a D4 exceptional drought since the big drought of 1988, which really started in 1987, didn't get over until 1990. So looking at this year, now through 2021, we have all these categories in the state somewhere. It is a big state, lots of weather patterns for the whole state. And I'll show a map about that in just a second here. So here's the U.S. Drought Monitor. You can see there's a wide range in drought. Big difference between Minnesota and even for our friends across the border in Wisconsin. They might be looking around saying, drought? What drought? I don't know what you're talking about. And it's even less of a factor as you go farther south. Illinois, Indiana, Ohio are set to have their record corn yields for this year because the growing conditions have been so good. Not quite the case here in Minnesota. We're lagging behind. Let's zoom in a little bit. Here's where the Drought Monitor stands right now. As you can see, in Minnesota, we have all kinds of ranges of drought. The far southeast, there's no drought at all. And up in northwest Minnesota, we're in that exceptional drought. For the Arrowhead, there's a big range of abnormally dry. Carleton County, there's been just enough rain for it hasn't been that bad there. And then as you go up the North Shore, it gets progressively worse as you get closer to Lake and Cook County, where things are much drier. We'll take a little look at Wisconsin too. Big difference, and there is a big difference right at the border. The path of the storms have been such they've been carrying almost due southward from Superior straight south through like Hayward, Rice Lake area, and they've been getting plenty of rain all summer long. So there's no drought really in a good chunk of Wisconsin until you get closer to southeast Wisconsin, closer to Milwaukee, and the Chicago areas had a drought too. So it's not really that bad yet. This is a look at the Standardized Precipitation Index, or SPI, going backwards in time to 1895. Anytime you see a deep red here, that's exceptional drought. And as you can see, we've had exceptional drought in Minnesota many times. But in recent years, you see a lot more blue. It's been really wet in the 2000s, almost little large time frame of drought at all. So you can kind of see the 1988 drought in there, and then you see the big ones like 1976, and then of course the 1930s, and then the 1910 stands out too. And on the very far right-hand side, that tiny little red part is our drought we're in right now. So this is another way to monitor how dry it is. This is that same index for looking at the whole state. And look at the sharp cutoff. Usually weather patterns don't follow state borders like this. This is kind of an unusual thing. But Wisconsin's just been a lot wetter than we have here in Minnesota. So turning it over a little bit, look at some historic heat waves in the state and Duluth. This is the big heat wave in Minnesota and Duluth. It's the greatest heat wave, July 1936. This is the Duluth News Tribune. And, of course, it was front page news, getting above 100. 100.5, they must have had a very good thermometer to get those half degrees in there. So this is a look at the weather records for Duluth in July 1936. There you see the 300s there. We had 9 days in Duluth of 90 degrees or higher. And then the all-time state record was in this heat wave too, with 114 degrees at Moorhead, and that still stands as the state record today. The warmest it got in Grand Marais, if you wanted to escape the heat, you could have. You go up to Grand Marais, 89 degrees was the hottest they were in this heat wave. Unfortunately, there were 900 deaths in Minnesota. There were many deaths in the Twin Cities. A lot of them died in were back in the day. They had poor farms in the state, and of course, no air conditioning, and many elderly residents died in that heat wave. Looking at something a little more modern, this is the August 4th through 7th, 2001 heat wave. This one was different from the 1936 heat wave, and in Duluth, there was dew point temperatures of 70 degrees or more for 51 hours straight. That's unusual to see in many places in Minnesota, but especially along Lake Superior. And the worst of it was there was a heat index of 102 degrees from 3 to 5 p.m. on August 5th of that year. And there were 5 deaths in Duluth. They were mostly people that were living in apartments, and they didn't have air conditioning or any ventilation, good ventilation in the apartments. And that's what happened. Now, the 900 deaths is a mistake. Sorry about that on the end there. I was trying to find the actual numbers, and I couldn't find it. And I think might be able to have some more of I was looking at the same heat wave in a bigger area too. So, but heat waves can occur even in modern days in Duluth as well. And of course, this year, the June through July 2021 was the 3rd warmest on record in Duluth. Only 2012 and 2006 were warmer when you put those 2 months together. Of course, the big asterisk too is where they measure the temperature has moved over time. And in 1936, of course, it was halfway up the hill. It wasn't at the airport in 1936. So there's a little location still matters when you measure temperature anywhere in the state, and especially in the Duluth area. So how does this in context of what we're seeing with climate change over time? So our annual average climate change, temperature's been going up faster in the north than the south. This is mainly due to winter lows becoming warmer. However, even in the summer, we have seen some increases in temperatures in the summer too. And looking at the normals, there's new normals out, 1991 through 2020. They became operational in May. Looking at June through August in Duluth, it's now 1.4 degrees warmer for the high temperature, and actually just under 1 degree warmer for the minimum temperature, and overall 1.2 degrees warmer than the average. So it has gone up in Duluth, and this is at the same place at the airport too. So it's the same location. So the largest change is the August high temperature has warmed the most for a summer temperature. So what about the future? Let's take a look at the future and see what could happen, at least in the next 6 to 10 days, and also the next couple of months. Is this heat wave going to break? Are we going to get some rain? Let's see. And of course, we're watching this like a hawk to see what's going to happen coming up. And this is the look at what the Climate Prediction Center is saying from August 22nd through 26th. So if you're looking at this later in a couple of weeks from now, you can go back and see if they were right. So it looks like what's happening is the heat bubble is shifting east over time. We're on the edge of it, so we still have a tendency for above normal temperatures in Minnesota and Wisconsin and in northeast Minnesota too. But to our west is below normal, and I'm sure they like a break in the heat there. Precipitation, this is looking good. We have a tendency for above normal precipitation coming up basically in a week or two in August, and that fits the weather pattern. It does look like it's going to become more active beginning this Friday. Cross fingers. We have a couple storm systems that are coming through, and the computer models are going back and forth how much precipitation we'll get, but I'll take anything at this point will help us out somewhat. How about looking further ahead, looking through August through October, the 3-month outlook? This is basically going into the fall. Still has a tilt for above normal temperatures across much of the country, especially in the Northeast and in Utah, where Utah has the worst of the drought conditions. There, almost the entire state has exceptional drought. So warmer conditions look like it'll continue. Precipitation, unfortunately, still looks like a tendency for below normal precipitation across the state for August, September, and October. And really looks like August is following suit right now for much of Minnesota and not so much in Wisconsin. They're getting more rain than we are here. So in summary, we're coming out of an extraordinary wet period. It's been a long time since we've had a real drought. The last time we had any significant drought in the state was 2012. So it's been about 10 years. This dryness began in 2020, really began to pick up in 2021. And droughts are part of Minnesota's climate, and there's been some really big droughts in the past. And really, Duluth is still an air-conditioned city, but heat waves can and do happen. And what we learned in the 1930s and in the 2001 outbreak is the poor and the elderly are the most affected by extreme heat. They might not always have the resources other people have to cool off. And that's kind of part of the message is, you know, especially for areas that don't have a lot of air conditioning because they haven't really needed it in the past. It's something definitely to look into. And that's some of the lessons learned from heat waves of the past. So everybody should still come to Duluth this summer, right? This is an ad from the 1930s. So during the Dust Bowl, so people try to escape the heat, go to Duluth, I suppose. So usually it's a cooler place than most other places. So if there's any questions, happy to see what I can do to help.
Thank you, Pete. There are questions in the chat box, and we're going to get to those after Maggie's presentation. Okay. So you may want to kind of just look through those and formulate your thoughts on those. So thank you so much. Now we are going to hear from Maggie Thelen from the Wisconsin Department of Health Services Climate and Health Program. She's the program manager. We're going to hear a little bit more about the health impacts from climate change and think about maybe who's most at risk and what can we do to help mitigate those impacts. But Maggie's comes to us with, let's see, a master's in public health and a bachelor's in environmental studies and biology. So it sounds like Maggie will have a good handle on the public health and the environmental connections. So thanks so much for being here, Maggie. And again, folks, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box and we'll try to get to all those after the presentation. Okay, Maggie, you can share your screen and
all right,
take it away. Thanks.
All right, just making sure everybody can see my screen. Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Maggie Thelen, and I am the Climate and Health Program Manager with the Wisconsin Department of Health Services. We're located in the Bureau of Environmental and Occupational Health. And I am coming at you right from Madison, Wisconsin. So quite a few hours drive up to Duluth and Superior, which I've only been to once, and I immediately want to go again. So it's a pleasure to speak with you guys today. So I'm going to go over a little bit, just a very brief overview, kind of comparing some of Wisconsin climate projections to Minnesota's here, give you the update on Wisconsin there. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the health impacts of a changing climate, which is the main focus of my program. And then also talk about the Wisconsin Climate and Health Program and also some of the resources that we provide to allow communities to help mitigate some of those health impacts from climate change. Okay, so I know we're talking a lot about extreme heat and extreme and drought right now. However, Wisconsin is becoming both warmer and wetter. We live in quite a landscape abundant with water, but there is a 15% increase in annual precipitation over the past 70 years and a projected increase in frequency of high intensity rain events. With this comes the increased risk of flood-related events. And we have had a little bit more rain than Minnesota, and we're having more frequent flooding and more frequent severe storms, including tornadoes and derechos in the state. And also, I just wanted to point out all these maps are from the Wisconsin Institute on Climate Change Impacts wiki. Without them, we wouldn't have these kind of projections available to us to use. Looking here, here is the historic temperature change. So overall, Wisconsin has warmed by between 1 and 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit, with a little bit of cooling up in the northeastern part of the state. You can see there, and I believe that is Florence County. So here is just a little bit, we're expected this warming trend to continue for years to come. And so depending on the different emission scenarios that our climatologists are looking at, Wisconsin may warm by anywhere between 3 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit by the year 2050. So this means that the frequency of very hot days are also expected to increase. So the figure on the left here shows that annual number of days above 90 degrees across the state, kind of looking at between 6.7 days and 6 days. So then you can compare that with the figure on the right, which shows the projected annual number of days above 90 degrees from 2041 to 2060. This is under a high emissions scenario. So with that, so then meaning warmer winters and increasing precipitation in late winter and early spring might then overall lead to less snow cover, impacting a lot of the tourism in northern Wisconsin and northern Minnesota. More freezing rain, leading to a lot of impacts with travel and driving, and as well as infrastructure damages that were not built to withstand this freezing rain. And the same thing with more ice storms. Also, I wanted to mention that harmful algal blooms, you might be hearing a little bit about this in some of your areas. So cyanobacteria, which is the bacteria that causes the harmful algal blooms, it grows faster in warmer temperatures and with plenty of sunlight. So we can expect the frequency and intensity of these cyanobacterial blooms in Wisconsin and elsewhere to increase, that is also becoming warmer throughout these few years. And also with drought intensity happening as well, there is further health impacts related to that and climate change. Okay, so then moving on to some of the health impacts of a changing climate. This graphic is from the CDC. I hope it's animating for you all. It just kind of goes and shows the different aspects of climate change: increasing CO2 levels, rising temperatures, more extreme weather, rising sea levels in relation to the different events: water quality impacts, allergens, extreme heat, severe weather, air pollution, as well as some of the associated health impacts around it. Extreme heat leading to extreme related illness and death, cardiovascular failure, severe weather, a lot with the mental health impacts. But basically, one thing I would add to this wonderful graphic is that the mental health impacts are across everything. And we need to be able to understand that and provide mechanisms for resiliency and coping for these climate-related health impacts. So while there are many human health impacts of climate change in Wisconsin and throughout the upper Midwest, including those on this slide, such as extreme cold and winter storms, increases in There are also increases in precipitation and flooding events, vector-borne diseases, mental health impacts, economic impacts, and power outages. So I just did a little bit graphic here with the heat and extreme snow, some of the vector-borne. I will say there is more research that needs to be done to see exactly how vector-borne diseases are impacted by the changing climate. It's been researched, but like nothing's very conclusive on if there is a moving vector towards the north as it gets warmer, like chikungunya or the Lone Star tick movement. Okay, so before moving on, I do want to take a moment to talk about the fact that the human health impacts of climate change are disproportionately felt by certain populations. So those include those with low income, communities of color, those with limited English proficiency, indigenous populations, children and pregnant women, older adults, vulnerable occupational groups, those that work outside, persons with disabilities, persons with pre-existing or medical conditions. And then I also just wanted to talk a little bit about the concepts of environmental and climate justice. So environmental justice from the EPA is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people with respect to the development, implementation, enforcement of environmental laws and regulations and policies. That is intrinsically tied to climate justice, which reorients that climate discourse from focusing solely on the reducing emissions and recasts it as human rights movement centering on communities most vulnerable and most at risk to climate change impacts in its solutions. Climate justice is an extension of environmental justice. Wanted to just bring that all together before moving on. Also, moving that climate and extreme weather events are community health concerns. It's important to build resilience and make it a collaborative effort and involve those most at risk in the emergency planning for climate change impacts. So emergency planning, preparedness, and response can help mitigate these community health problems from climate change. Okay, so then I want to talk a little bit about the Wisconsin Climate and Health Program and also some of the resources we developed that can help communities and local health departments and local planning agencies and local nonprofits, basically any local organization, to be able to assess their vulnerability and also inform adaptation strategies towards climate change. So just a little background on our program. So we are funded through the CDC. There are currently 16 cities and states, including Minnesota, which has a wonderful program, and I will link to their website in the last couple slides here. So we're funded by the CDC, and our main goal then is to study climate change impacts on public health and use best practices from across the country to identify different adaptation strategies, tools, trainings to help communities prepare for health outcomes, climate change in an equitable way. One thing we also emphasize in Wisconsin, and I'm sure everywhere else in the country, is health equity, climate justice throughout all of our adaptation strategies and all of our work. We also are looking on sustaining and expanding efforts and well as embedding climate change and health equity throughout the entire Division of Public Health and the Department of Health Services. Also, again, emphasizing that resilience. So being able to plan and prepare for climate and weather events. We're looking to build capacity within our communities, as well as protecting our most vulnerable citizens from climate change impacts. So just some of the climate change and health tools and resources I'm going to be briefly talking about that that people can use. So we have extreme weather toolkits. We have a flood resiliency scorecard. We have the risk assessment flood tool, as well as emphasizing climate in all policies. We've also identified, we've done some assessments at the state. So we've created a heat vulnerability index, as well as conducted a community assessment of public health emergency response surrounding extreme heat in the city of Milwaukee. So we have extreme weather toolkits that I will show in the next slide that are available for a variety of topics, including extreme heat, winter weather, thunderstorms and tornadoes, drought, wildfire, vector-borne disease, flood, chemical releases, as well as a harmful algal bloom one as well. So the target audience for these are local public health professionals and local government officials and all of these toolkits outline the various extreme weather events and how public health and healthcare can respond to them. So in these toolkits, they include response checklists as well as talking points for responding to media and message maps with those key messages that are important to get across during and after the response. And here is a picture of one of the extreme heat toolkit. Overall, all the toolkits also include climate definitions, health outcome information, as well as some of the history of the toolkit topic in Wisconsin. It looks at the at-risk populations, as well as checklists, talking points, and message maps, as I previously said. And these can all be found on our website, which I have linked to later on in the slideshow. Another tool that we have is a flood resilience scorecard. So this is in partnership with the Wisconsin Sea Grant that we created a guide for local officials and local planning professionals to assess flood risk and resiliency capacity. So there are 3 modules to this scorecard: environmental, institutional, and social. And the people completing the scorecard will answer multiple choice questions surrounding the different types of resiliency that they have in their community using existing plans as well as federally available databases. And then one thing I previously mentioned that we wanted to embed the climate change conversation in all of our planning. And this is an internal product at the moment, but we have developed a climate in all policies checklist. So to incorporate climate change and its impact on health within the programs within the Division of Public Health. We're starting with our Bureau of Environmental Occupational Health, but have looked at using this and incorporating it into existing health equity checklists throughout the division. We want this conversation to be collaborative and have strategic planning in place and focus. Even if a program like lead and asbestos certification and licensing doesn't necessarily think about climate change a lot, it allows them to reframe their strategic planning to think, what happens if extreme heat becomes more common? What happens to our contractors who have to be exposed to this? Is there any way we can assist them on our level to make this have less of those health outcomes? Looking at this, we have the heat, and this is the heat vulnerability index for Wisconsin. So this was developed based on San Francisco's heat vulnerability index, and it includes a variety of heat variables. So these include 22 different variables grouped into 4 categories. We have population density, looking at extreme heat, hospitalizations, and mortality, demographic and socioeconomic factors directly related to heat health outcomes, and then natural and built environment factors, including concrete and various other aspects that kind of contribute to climate change and the urban heat island effect. A lot of times for this application, we have individual county-wide maps as well that we allow that local environmental groups, local planners, and local public health are able, as well as tribal health, are able to incorporate into their hazard mitigation plans, incorporate into various other plans that they are working on updating on a regular basis. And several counties and municipalities in Wisconsin do have specific climate change and sustainable groups and positions within their local government that use the maps as well to help plan for extreme heat events, where to put cooling centers, and other aspects to heat response. Also just wanted to go into a little bit on our Casper survey. So this is a rather rigorous methodological survey that we conducted in the city of Milwaukee. And most of the times Casper surveys are done retroactively following a extreme weather event like a flood or a hurricane. But what we wanted to see is the preparedness aspect and using the Casper method to do that. So just some of the key findings, which I'm sure people will find interesting. I know every time I read about them again, I'm like, oh, we found this out. That is weird. So we were able to find that 91% of the households reported having some form of air conditioning, which is good. But 56% of the households felt too hot inside their home, sometimes, most of the time, or always. 32% of the households had symptoms due to heat the past summer, and this was in 2018. So not a particularly hot summer, but still we were able to feel it. And then 63% of the households do not know the location of a cooling center or a place they could go to if they are feeling too hot. Okay, and then here is just a list right now of the tools and resources I briefly talked about, including where our climate and health web pages and where the Minnesota Climate and Health Program web pages. They do have a newsletter that they send out probably about every other month that contains a lot of specific Minnesota information, and they have really good communication for that. We have linked to the extreme weather toolkits, the flood resiliency scorecard. We also have an additional ArcGIS interactive tool called the RAFT, the risk assessment flood tool. I got my own acronym wrong. I apologize. That you're able to layer the FEMA flood layers with critical infrastructure, as well as like population proximity to floodplains, heat, and then the heat vulnerability index. Okay, then I guess I'm ready for questions. I think I'm a little early, or am I on time?
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Maggie. Super interesting and informative, and what a great program you have over there in Wisconsin. And then if